我是北美馆的馆员冯欣，然后也是今年度开放网络计划刚好负责到这两个从线上到线下的整个统筹这样子。那我们今天很开心能够举办开放网络计划，就是线上展《消失的反动》的第一场活动，策展人分享。开放网络计划，我先稍微简介一下，是从2024年由北美馆开始发起的一个计划。那这个计划很希望，一方面去探索艺术如果在线上有什么样的可能性呢？那也一方面去讨论关于目前数位艺术或是科技上的发展。那我们很幸运的是，其实今年度线上展的合作以及这次的主持人也都是奠基于去年其实我们的线下展共遇4，那他们两个就有一个合作，那也间接促成了今年度线上展的主题跟内容。那我们接下来就把时间留给我们今天的主持人祥云，然后还有 Doreen。
大家好，我是祥云，是今天的主持人。自我介绍一下，我之前呢主要是在做策展跟艺术创作，那我关注的主题是赛博女性主义跟数位物质主义。这两个主题其实跟今天Doreen策的消失的反动有非常大的关联。它也跟我之前策划过的两个展，一个是台北数位艺术节真相碎片，还有去年的北美馆开放网络计划 WW 反转资料库Commons 这两个展览有很深的关系。那在台北数位艺术节真相碎片是在讨论假新闻跟演算法治理，但是我们在展览里面有很多现场的行为艺术跟用低科技的方式，那这是一个非常物质的方式，把网络物质化的一种创作方法。那在去年北美馆开放网络计划的时候，我们也跟艺术家讨论说怎么用自己的身体去展现网络上面的一些现象。那今年北美馆的开放网络的一个线下展曲家为沉默的声音里面呢，讨论很多水下的考古这个技术。那我觉得它其实也可以跟今天的一些作品来做一个呼应，所以这整个开放网络计划，它在这跨年度上面有一个主题上的连贯性。那我现在就来跟大家介绍一下这一次的策展人 Doreen 是墨西哥的独立策展人跟研究者，那他同时也是 Antimateria 的创办人。他也曾经是墨西哥数位艺术中心的首席策展人。现在我们欢迎 Doreen 来为我们介绍今天的线上展览。
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much for the broader introductions for this talk, as well as for the invitation to curate this second online exhibition for NetOpen program. I will now go ahead and share my screen so I can introduce a little bit more on my work. Sorry about that, I was still muted. All right, well, I'd like to expand a little bit on the work that I have done over the past 10 years as a curator, dedicating specifically to practices that touch and delve with technology. I would like to start by saying that ever since I started working with art and technology as a specific field of focus for my curatorial career, one of the things that I have encountered is how vulnerable and how fragile working with digital materiality really is for both artists and curators, but also for people who collect and preserve this type of work. This has obviously created a series of strategies that I myself have found very interesting in regards to working with technology, but also in a way how artists have found strategies to confront and to face and even to work around these limitations. This has led me, of course, to consider from the curatorial perspective how to approach these limitations and even to wonder whether or not these are limitations as such, or rather if these are also possibilities for both artists, curators, to touch on and to delve further in what it means to work creatively with the use of technology. Interestingly, my background really started as a student of architecture. And as we know, architecture is perhaps one of these areas of production that touches more broadly in maintaining or keeping itself alive through time. However, as I started moving further into a curatorial practice, again, specifically touching on or working with artists, developing work through and within technology, I found that there are many spaces for opportunity, which I'd like to introduce in a series of case studies that I have been able to work around in the past years. I would like to say, first of all, that my work, although it has of course touched with exhibition spaces and unfolded within exhibition spaces that we might consider more traditional, for example, museums and gallery spaces, or the so-called white cube, it is also interesting for me to say that even within these traditional spaces, the presentation or the introduction of artistic practices working with technology has also represented a challenge. These are two of the exhibitions that I have been able to curate in the context of the White Cube. And these two also have represented or have meant a very specific set of skills that had to unfold within the exhibition space that I would like to share individually by speaking to the experience of curating these two exhibitions. On one side of the screen, we can see ligera como una pluma, tiesa como una tabla, which can be translated into English as soft as a feather, stiff as a board. This was an exhibition that I was invited to curate for the Hello World Festival, which is held in Mexico City yearly, roughly around summertime. The exhibition is normally introduced as an open call, and for this particular one, I put forward the idea of working within the concept of a ritual, whether individual rituals or collective rituals, traditional rituals and contemporary ones as well, but particularly those pertaining to the use of technology. However, one of the main challenges here was the fact that the artists were developing new work for this exhibition, and yet at the same time, this, let's say, this invitation to produce new work was also embraced as a possibility for understanding how these works would unfold within the curatorial project at large. As we know, some of the works that have been developed with the use of technology hold the conditions of being interactive. And that also poses a challenge, specifically when trying to think about the audience and how the audience can or should approach the works, especially when you have a combination of both, a combination of those that should be activated through interaction and those that should be contemplated from afar. This consideration has followed my curatorial practice as one of the key questions on how to introduce works like this within a context that needs to navigate, particularly when it comes from a curatorial perspective, between those that can be approached, those that can't be approached, and then also those that require perhaps other elements that go all together with them so that they are really situated within the exhibition space. On the other side of the screen, we can see Espacios Líquidos, Políticas de la Pantalla, which can be translated as Liquid Spaces, Screen Politics, which is a more recent exhibition that I had the opportunity to curate for the University Biennial of Multimedia Art for the University of San Francisco in Quito, Ecuador. As we can see here, both of the works presented, although the exhibitions are 4 years apart from one another, hold a similar sensibility to the ways in which the audience is invited to engage with the work. The exhibition space that exists and that operates outside of the screen, although it has its very peculiar conditions, it is one that we have been able to see develop in a much broader sense. And therefore, as curators, we have been able to access many tools in order to articulate such an experience. But one of the questions that I have had as a curator myself is, what happens with all of the work, particularly with the work that touches and uses technology outside of these exhibition spaces? This has led me to look for other possibilities to understand artistic practices that can exist outside of the walls of the museum and the gallery, but also to consider how these are being embraced by a broader audience that might not necessarily be looking for this kind of experiences. These are two examples of exhibitions that happen or that have occurred outside of the screen and that have also allowed for different kind of experiences to unfold, both for the artist, for the audience, but also, of course, for me as a curator. On one side, we can see arte en escala urbana, which can be translated as urban scale art, which is part of the initiative Benito Green, which takes place in the northern part of Mexico, in Ciudad Juárez, every couple of years. This is the 2022 edition, where, as you can see here, I got to select from an open call again a series of works that would later on be printed in a large scale, high fidelity image, and then presented in billboards on different spaces within this border city. And although, as we can probably already see, many of these works, although they have started as a collaboration with technology, the output or the final form they take might not necessarily hold those interactive features that originally created them. However, as an experience in itself, it was very meaningful to see the ways in which the audience understood the work in itself, the ways in which the audience allowed to have the experience, have the aesthetic experience outdoors, and make a decision for themselves on how to engage with the work that they are seeing. This intuition, however, has been something that I've been very interested in exploring, especially after the second exhibition that you can see here, which is titled My Wall is Your Filter Bubble, which I co-curated with Matthew Plomer Fernandez for the Abandoned Normal Devices Festival in 2017. This exhibition was the first hybrid exhibition that I got to curate. And when we were invited to create this show, we were framed by two main limitations. The first one being that this was meant to be an outdoors exhibition. And the second one being that there was not going to be any infrastructure whatsoever for us to use. With this, I mean, there are no walls, there are no power outlets, there is very little internet connection, and yet it had to be held in these circumstances and present work that touches and develops itself through technology. For this exhibition, what we did is to propose an augmented reality application that worked somewhere between a sculptural garden and Pokemon Go, which was very much in fashion back then, but it was really the beginnings of augmented reality applications paired up with geolocation technologies. And this experience really opened up the door for me as a curator to consider other ways of engaging with this type of work. And of course, in a way, this also made me reconsider the possibilities of online spaces perhaps a little bit backwards in the sense that I started, let's say, through an opposite experience from outside of the screen to the hybrid space, and finally really trying to explore and touch the screen space. Which leads me to two of the online exhibitions that I have curated recently before Vanishing Acts, but two who really inform the ways in which some of my ideas were framed for this new exhibition for NetOpen project. On one hand, we can see Minimal Rituals, which took the form of a browser extension. This was an exhibition that I curated under the invitation of Arbeit Gallery. And like I said, as a browser extension, this exhibition was really experimental. Broadly speaking, what we did here was to schedule a series of pop-up screens to appear daily over the course of 28 days that would show work from 8 different artists, and that would change as the time went by. On the other side of the screen, you can see a screen capture of Tácticas Poéticas, or Poetical Tactics, which was an exhibition for Real Mix Festival, a Colombian festival, part of IDARTES. This was presented last year and was introduced as a 3D space. It was in this context, in this moment of my life, where I received the invitation from the Taipei Fine Arts Museum to curate the second exhibition for their online platform. So I already had many questions boiling up after these two experiences. This is how we get to the idea of vanishing acts. And it really is the result of many years of exploring the spaces in between the artworks and the audience, but also really considering a radical shift, particularly after 2020, where many exhibitions were being held online. As we know, many of the experiences that we had from 2020 to 2022, roughly speaking, were already exploring many of the tools that were previously available, that we saw developed and unfold through the lens of many very interesting curators. And yet there was an overload that made these experiences really demand a shift in the ways in which we thought about the online spaces. That's how we get to the main or the original proposal that I put forward once that I was invited to curate this show. And it had been something that had been sitting with me for a while now, especially, like I said, after experiencing a really big wave of digitized experiences, digitized art experiences in particular. And really the creative process behind Vanishing Acts as a proposal, at least in the frame of its concept, had to do with to stop thinking about the internet as an archive and start thinking as the internet more like a performance. As we know, many theorists and researchers, particularly those that are deeply critical of the consequences of the hyperconsumption of technology, have pointed towards degrowth as a way of thinking through this problem. Of course, degrowth as an idea is still highly speculative, highly abstract, and yet it holds something very powerful within it. These ideas of degrowth, and perhaps to really try to concretize how this could look like, was the, let's say, the first trigger or the first provocation for me to come up with Vanishing Acts. But also this was paired up with another realm of conversation that was being put forward that has to do with natural systems. Particularly to think about how within nature, of course, what we can see is a rise and fall, a constant movement, a constant motion that occurs within life for it to be able to be sustainable, for it to be able to remain throughout time, but also for it to be able to renew itself. By mixing these two ideas, one of the growth and the other one to consider natural systems as perhaps a way in which we can reach or we can acquire a better relationship, one that is more comprehensive, careful, and holistic with the technologies that we have already developed. In the mixture of these two is where the idea for vanishing acts really emerged. As we can see here, part of the first steps for the conceptualization for this exhibition was to try to come across with some concepts that could make sense of these ideas being put together. So what we're looking at in here in this slide are some tests, perhaps, of how these ideas could mix. So we can see how this links back to ephemerality, this links back to the tactical over the strategical, this links back to consider life and death as a recursive cycle, but also there's something perhaps quite mystical, even mysterious about concealment and hiding and the elusiveness of these considerations or these manifestations that was deeply sensible and, of course, as such, deeply meaningful, perhaps, to start a conversation with artists that could unpack these sensibilities into different frameworks, into different ideas, and potentially create their own world-building systems from these provocations. With this in mind, now after putting together these ideas and trying to work around what this could mean for artistic practice, I started to look into many artists that I had either already collaborated with, new artists that I have yet to explore, and try to figure out which profiles might be interested and suited for this quest. One of the provocations or the ambitions that I had also originally was to be able to think of an online exhibition that was available in 3 different languages. I invite, of course, everyone to come over to the exhibition and to navigate it and to work around the space, because it was really something that I thought was key to really make sense of an online space, especially an online space that could communicate with various different audiences. And that was something that I also had in mind when thinking about the artists that I would be inviting for this. It was very clear to me that I wanted artists who were working from within different aesthetic practices, different discursive practices, and also who belonged to different generations as well. I really wanted to touch on how this approach to the internet specifically has changed so radically through a very short period of time. And that's the reason why I wanted to look for really a mixture of artists and perspectives that could present that into the show. With this in mind, the artists that I end up choosing for these commissions were Federico Pérez Villoro, Anna Riedler, Olia Lialina, and Jung Soo. Of course, I knew that these artists had very different perspectives for this kind of provocation, but also I wanted to allow for them to have a lot of freedom on how to play around, with the idea of degrowth and the idea of going back on reinterpreting a natural system that can decay, that can change, and of course, that can potentially even disappear. With this in mind, when I invited the artists to join this show and to join this commission, I shared with them these ideas, and then I asked them if there was anything, any concept, any specific keyword perhaps that they would like to pursue after sharing with them the curatorial intentions with you. And that's how we come across with the four main axes of the show. The first one is memory, and memory became part of the, or was the main keyword for artist Jung Soo for her work Collected Memory Carved from the Fragmented Past, because she was already in a way working with the topic. Her work had been somewhere in between non-human intelligence, time-based practices, and also a very sensible approach to potentially the disappearance of certain technological devices, particularly those that we use to hold or to save or to share our memories. We talked a lot about how memory is always half complete or is always in the verge of being reshaped through time, and how this works not only when we consider technological devices, but also when we consider memory for our own personal history, right? And how this touches with a very specific need for saving up the bits and pieces that we consider important. For this particular piece, what Jung Soo proposed was to go on the look for USB sticks that were either missing or found, and to try and recreate the contents that were within them, obviously with a very careful perspective not to intrude in someone else's privacy, but rather to hold the, let's say, basic elements that she could hold from within the data that was available in them. In this way, what the artist proposed was to try and recreate the very literal memory of the USB stick that doesn't belong to her, sometimes doesn't even belong to someone that she knows, and to rebuild those memories from within the technical possibilities of the USB stick. In this way, what she proposed was a fictional recreation, but then also to consider or to ask, what are all of these fragments of memories that we have lost, both in an abstract, sensible way within our own memory, and also those that we have in a way externalized through the use of technological devices. A second concept that emerged when I started having these conversations with the artists that were invited to join the show was when I was speaking with artist Olia Lialina, and she put forward the idea of fragility. And Olia Lialina is a very interesting artist. She has been working with the internet since the very beginnings of the internet. And a lot of her work started from an expanded narrative that could give the audience certain agency over the work, all the way into rescuing fragments of the internet that had already in many ways disappeared. With Olia, I got to spend a lot of time thinking about the contradicting perspectives of the internet. On one hand, how on the beginnings of the internet, a lot of people thought that whatever was posted or whatever was saved within the World Wide Web would live there forever, right? And yet, with the passage of time, we have realized that that's very much quite the opposite. We can see that in, for example, how easily files get corrupt, websites cease to exist, or even full platforms just one day decide that they are not profitable anymore and therefore just, become extinct within the web, which was the case of GeoCities. GeoCities was a website that allowed the users who were not knowledgeable of how to code or how to program their own websites to be able to create a website of their own, but while using a predetermined template that didn't require a lot of technical knowledge for them to use. This was one of the platforms that was most used back in the day, and many people created their own websites from within this service. However, it became extinct some years ago, and all of those websites disappeared with it. This is a project that Olia has been looking into for a longer time, which is that of rescuing or trying to bring back to life some of the websites that disappeared because of the extinction of GeoCities. But something very interesting happened when I extended this invitation for her, especially as she had been working in rescuing GeoCities websites for a longer time, which is that of her findings regarding websites dedicated to dogs. She found it very interesting that for some reason, many people back in the early 2000s were creating websites either as a homage to dogs that have passed, blogs where dogs pose as the ones posting information to review dog food, treats, so on and so forth. Also, other websites that were dedicated to creating sort of like a family photo album that included at the center of it all their dog. This finding led the artist to speculate about some of the reasons why this was the case, and that's the reason why she decided to put forward this work titled "On the Internet, Everybody Knows You Had a Dog," because she felt that, in a way, the reason why people were so invested in creating websites for their dogs was precisely because they thought that the internet would provide a space that would last longer, and in this way to keep the memories and save the memories of their loved furry pets for a longer period of time. A third perspective on this invitation was that of Anna Riedler. She put forward the idea of the ghost, which is probably the one that falls a little bit outside of the categories that the other artists were considering for their works. But this one has a very peculiar take as to why it is framed in such a way. For this artwork titled "Every Single Iris on the Internet, the First 100,000 Images," what Anna proposed was to have a look into the datasets that train many of the most used and famous AI models available today. When she started this research, she realized that many of the diffusion models, which are those that create images from text, were being trained by the same dataset, which is in this case named Lion 5. And this database is one that, yes, it is made out of images from the internet, categorized and tagged with specific names and characteristics that they hold. But she also realized that this data set is not particularly up to date. As we have seen with the previous examples, touching on memory and touching on fragility, it is no surprise that many of the images that create the Lion 5 dataset have disappeared over time, and therefore what we find within its files instead is a missing image, a ghost image. And that's where the idea of the ghost started for Anna while thinking about this work. Now, as we know, of course, these databases are gigantic. So she could not focus on finding every single image that had disappeared over time. And that's the reason why she wanted to focus specifically on those that were tagged as iris. Therefore, this artwork that we see here is an exploration of those images that have disappeared over time, and also the ways in which the tags that they carry, in this case iris, can never really frame every single way in which the word is used. Because as we know, iris can be the flower, but iris can also be a specific body part belonging to the eye. But also, iris can also be the name of a person, or the name of a book, or the name of a place. In this way, the artist is not only exploring the ghost of the images that have disappeared from the database, but also the ghost of language that is not able to cover every single possible meaning associated to a word. And this brings us to our last concept, which is that of matter. This one is associated to Federico Pérez Villoro's work. As we can see, the previous concepts are touching with bits and pieces that come from the abstract sense of developing a memory, or that come from an aspect of working with technological devices and the vulnerability and fragility associated to them, and also the instability of meaning and language, and the instability of the ever-changing ways in which content of the internet is circulated. But here, Federico wants us to really go back, to really go out of the screen and focus on one, or in this case, on what the internet is made out of. In this way, for Federico, the vulnerable or the vanishing act of this matter, in this case of the internet infrastructure matter, has to do with something much more physical. For this work, Federico proposed to do a research on how the internet gets into different regions of the world, particularly focusing on Mexico, but also touching in other geographies. What we can see presented in his work titled No Distance has to do with the physical remnants, the physical wounds, and the physical elements that allow for the internet infrastructure to exist. What we can see in his work are the marks, the evidence on how, very literally, the internet makes it to Earth. We see the traces of fiber optic cables. We see the remnants on how this looks in the land, in the landscape, how it intervenes within the territories. And of course, it prompts the question, what is it doing to all of that exists around it? Therefore, these four artists, as we have seen, touch on the notion of a vanishing act, not only through four different perspectives, to four different frameworks, to four different sensibilities, but also through four acts as such. For Jung-Soo, that is the act of remembering and thinking of memory. For Olia Lialina is the act of reinventing or recreating that brings back or holds a loved one. In the case of Anna Riedler, this means to reenact the disappearance of a file. And for Federico, this means to testify on the reality of the materials that are being put together to create the infrastructures that we use. Thank you so much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions or comments that you might have.
Yeah, thank you for Dory's amazing lecture. I will ask the first question. I think in the beginning of the lecture, you were mentioning that you think the internet, or like this statement, the internet is not an archive, but more like a performance because it's fragile and it kind of resonate your exhibition. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more on this idea and how these kind of incorporate in your curatorial practice or your view on curating online exhibitions.
I would say that the first moment where I realized that the internet particularly works at a different pace, it has a different way of dealing with temporality, was just, by navigating very early on as a teenager and realizing that the exchanges that occur within this space are not occurring in the same way in which we relate to one another outside of the screen. Later in life, when I started my career as a curator, and particularly working with digital technologies, I realized that that was a space for opportunity, but also very much a challenge, especially when it comes to thinking on how to socialize this work. Something that I realized is that when we think about the digital, perhaps not only the internet, but broadly speaking, the digital, there's always some concepts that are related to it. On one hand, of course, we have the immateriality. On the other hand, we have something that is intangible. We think about a relationship with these works that feels like happens outside of the body somehow. However, as we know, nothing really happens outside of the body. Everything is really just a cycle. So one of the cases where I realized we were dealing with a similar condition, particularly in terms of the temporality and the relations that we build from within that, I could see that happening within music, but also more broadly speaking, I could see that happening with performance practices. Performance practices also have a very unique way of working around the temporality and the moments that they activate. And that was something that I thought was very useful to think about a curatorial practice online. If we were to consider the type of temporality that we are working with and framing it in such a way that it creates a space to build relationships or to build exchanges, instead of thinking of it as a repository, then something different could emerge from that.
Yeah, exactly. And also performance is also really like material, and you can present in a kind of a temporary assembly or like together at the same time. And I think you also mentioned in your curatorial statement that the cloud is not just a virtual thing that's floating in the sky, but has a really strong material presence. So it's like Federico's artwork that I think the audience, if you haven't seen, is you can check the online. That work kind of mark all these resources that an internet infrastructure needs, like have hard drive, servers, cables, and all that. But we often mistakenly think the cloud is like a single virtual object. And my question is like, maybe you could kind of explain a bit kind of the situation of the internet infrastructure, maybe in Latin America, or how you think of these kind of influence your curatorial practice and what the role of the internet infrastructure plays.
That's a very interesting and very important question, particularly when it comes to Federico's work, which is totally about that. Not only because it reminds us that nothing exists out of nothing, but also because it brings us back to the conversation of where is the internet and what is the internet. Now, in Latin America, as we know, there are many extraction sites, mineral extraction sites particularly, but most recently there have been many regions that have been covered with servers in order to either keep the internet going, or more recently to be used for AI development as well. That's something that I've always found very important to pinpoint when thinking about the internet, which is that it is very much rooted in like what Benjamin Bratton would call the stack. This stack is a multi-layer system, and this multi-layer system is dependent on every single layer of it to be active. And the baseline of it all is, of course, the mineral extraction, but also the labor invested in it. And if I may perhaps share just the broad interface of the exhibition, I would say that how this has influenced my curatorial practice, specifically on online exhibitions, is that you can sense that there's always this layered aesthetic to it that you can, or that you have to peel apart so that you can access all of the bits and pieces of the show. But it is also an echo of this layered system that is the internet as such.
Okay, Doreen, you want to share a bit with the internet, your exhibition, right? You want to explain what's the stack part?
I believe we have an additional question, but I can navigate so that everyone gets a sense of what I mean about these layers. You can see it even from the very beginning, right? Like you can see on the about section how everything is linked back to folders within folders, files within folders that are being embraced in a broader system that makes everything come together. That's the main idea for the platform as it is.
So we have one question from the audience that's actually related to the interface design. So this person asked that I'm curious about the curatorial practice of Doreen from before and also this time. Every time is quite different. Did you also discuss the interface design with the artists other than the concept?
Yes, thank you for the question. I would say yes, but first of all of the exhibitions that I've curated, I would say that are specific to the work that is presented. I normally like to work, I would say, first thinking about the main or the core concept, then going into exploring that with the artists without imposing it on their work, but rather exchanging with. I was just gonna add in terms of the interface as such, I would say that this was very much inspired from the work and from the ideas that the artists were putting forward as well. So it was, I would say, a collaboration, mainly with the design team for sure, but certainly in conversation with the works.
那有位观众品杰
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
好 hello. I have a more pragmatic questions. The curatorial statement mentioned a kind of the complexity relationship between humans and digital tools or technologies. It seems to me that it's almost inevitable as the convenience and the efficiency that brings have become irresistible. So beyond offering an alternative interpretation of the nature of the internet we see in these exhibitions, I would like to ask the questions, do we have any more concrete strategy that could respond to this complexity? Thank you.
A very powerful question. Of course, I would say there is no easy answer. There is no straightforward answer, but what I can offer are a couple of ideas of what I've seen emerge during the years. The first one would be the role that artistic practice has in this conversation. And I would say that the first step is really to acknowledge what these contradictions are, to evidence what the consequences of, let's say, mindless implementation can have in not only in our lives, but in everything around us. And a second moment, I would say, that has to do with thinking about creating our own tools. that is something that we have seen, for example, in the context of Latin America, emerging in community internet services. We can see that as well in repair shops, in the remixing and reinventing of technologies by repairing them from most importantly reused bits and pieces in order to create or satisfy a need, but also in a way to work around the electronic waste that is also very much a consequence of this.